Between members and trustees is a talk by Professor A.C.Grayling, who, as you will know, has long been a distinguished supporter, distinguished humanist, and recently became Vice President for BHA. Anthony is somebody who both in his speaking and writing presents sometimes quite challenging, difficult philosophical ideas in an accessible way to all types of people. I find his writing both stimulating and easy to follow. Please welcome A.C.Grayling.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, as you know, the French say, or they are said to say, well, it works in practice, but does it work in theory? And this is the moment in the afternoon when, after discussing very important practical issues all day, we turn our attention just briefly for half an hour to some slightly more theoretical ones, but they bear directly on some of the practical concerns that the BHA is involved with. Because, as you know, one of the very pressing things, and indeed it's been an important topic today, is the new academies schools explosion, which is just about to happen, and the fact that very many of them are going to be faith-based. One could think of lots of other alternative names to faith-based, ignorance-based and tangentialist-based and propaganda-based and the rest of it. But it is a very serious matter because we are not only faced with the prospect of more faith-based schools and more schools founded, run to an agenda which is not a neutral educational agenda, if there is such a thing. I'll come back to that point in a moment, because it's an important one, obviously. Our faith-based opponents might say that our desire for a broader, more open, and perhaps more humanist kind of education is itself tendentious, and we need to respond to that argument. In fact, I was just talking to Naomi a little bit earlier about the fact that we don't want the term humanism to become just another label in a barrage of labels. You know, there's Christianity and Islam and this and that and the other, and there's humanism as if it was one in the pick and mix box. It isn't. The fact of the matter is that Western liberal democracies here at the beginning of the 21st century are the outcome. They were manufactured, produced by the Enlightenment. And what happened in the Enlightenment, or what the post-Enlightenment settlement involves, is the application of rational and secular thinking to the problems of society, to the organization of institutions in society, and to thinking about education. And it's tremendously important that, therefore, we should remind people, since people become unaware of the wallpaper of their lives, that humanist values and secular values are the wallpaper of modern Western democracies, even indeed in the United States of America, because after all it is officially a secular country. Well, these points are all the more important now because we have a kind of double whammy that we're facing. On the one hand, we have these very large public funding cuts which are going to impact on the education sphere as much as they do on every other sphere. And at the same time, we have a government which is bent on liberalizing education in a lot of different ways, introducing a lot more opportunity for private bodies and the rest. And that isn't an entirely bad thing, but it can have bad consequences if we're not very watchful about it. And the worst of those possible bad consequences, of course, would be to institutionalize the great, the brilliant, the wonderful, the exemplary experiment of Northern Ireland, where they divided people into Catholic schools and Protestant schools, and as you see, the country blossoms with flowers every spring and summer, and everybody loves everybody else. So we have to be aware of this potential, this difficulty that's facing us now. And part of being aware of that is to remind ourselves of something that we take for granted, and that is the importance and the impact of education. And that's not something that one can just assume to be true very simply. You will remember that three of the most significant figures in philosophy of the 20th century, Bertrand Russell, Karl Popper, and Ludwig Wittgenstein, all of them, after the awful disaster of the First World War, all of them went into school teaching because they all believed that it was school teaching that would save the world, that would produce a better world. Bertrand Russell started a school, and Down House, not Down House, that's Darwin, Telegraph House, isn't it, in Sussex, I think it was, or Surrey, somewhere in the south of England. And it was rather a notorious school. The problem with it was that parents sent their very difficult children to it who wouldn't be let into any other schools, and consequently none of them really succeeded, and the school didn't flourish, although it lasted quite a long time because Dora Black, Russell's partner and then wife, ran it effectively while Russell did lots of lecture tours in America trying to raise money for it. And it's notorious for having been the sort of school at which, and you remember the story, the bishop turns up at the front door, which is opened by a naked child, and the bishop, startled, says, "Good God," and the naked child says, "There isn't one." And this is the legend that's grown up around Telegraph House, and even if it isn't true, it has a kind of higher truth, because after all, that was the sort of institution that Russell tried to make it. So what he thought, and both Popper and Wittgenstein thought, that if they were to get children sort of early, if they were able to socialize them, if they were able to get them to think, to be reflective, if they were able to put into the future a cadre of more reflective, more open-minded, and better educated, better scientifically educated people, that it would leaven the social loaf in a very important way. And of course, they all failed in their different ways, but Popper least of all. I mean, it's a forgotten fact about Popper, who's thought of quite rightly, principally as a philosopher of science, that he began life as an educationalist. In fact, all his education was in education and in the psychology of education. His doctoral dissertation and his habilitation dissertation were on the psychology of education. And he taught in school. He was a secondary school teacher of mathematics and physics. He read maths, physics, and philosophy at Vienna University. And for the larger part of the 1930s, he taught in a secondary school in Austria. And it was while he was doing that he wrote The Logic of Scientific Discovery, which of course released him from school teaching, which is infinitely harder, much more difficult and much more work than teaching at university. The relationship between teaching at school and teaching at university is a bit like the relationship that Mrs. Patrick Campbell described as that between the chaise longue and the marriage bed, the hurly-burly of the marriage bed versus the peace, the hurly-burly of the chaise longue versus the peace of the marriage bed. But it's a bit like that with with teaching at school, where people really do have to work hard, and at university where we don't. So, of course, it was a happy release for Popper, but he never gave up his interest in the possibilities of education. Wittgenstein went and taught in a village school, more as one of those gestures to which he was rather given. As you know, he was a smart fellow, but not a very agreeable one. And he had to flee this village where he was teaching in the village school because he had knocked one of his pupils unconscious. This poor child bled from one ear. He was so irritated by stupidity that this boy, who in fact was not a very well child, and it would irritate Wittgenstein, and he hit him, and the boy was knocked unconscious, and he had to run from the village for fear of the parents, quite rightly, and he gave up teaching for that reason. But the important thing is that all three of them felt this terrible disaster, and it's so important for us to be imaginative in our revisiting of historical circumstances. If you think, for example, as another great example of recent times, of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the years immediately after the Second World War, when people were confronted with the immediacy of the horrors of large-scale war, the massive destruction of cities, and above all, the appalling atrocities committed against human beings in the Holocaust and in other aspects of that war. And it was coming out of that with this vivid sense of the importance of doing things that the United Nations, the nations united in the UN, agreed on the back actually of rather relatively little discussion in the committee that was chaired by Ms. Roosevelt, to adopt this very striking document. Well, that came out of a lively, deep, genuinely felt set of sentiments about what was needed and what would be right. And in just that way, people after the First World War, desperate to try to work out a way of making it possible for a better world to emerge from the ruins of that war, were prepared to commit themselves to that sort of endeavor. And what they were doing, what all three of them were doing, was reprising something that, of course, had been a very integral part of thinking about education right back into antiquity. Of course, you're all familiar with the fact that when the Jesuits were set up in the 16th century, they saw immediately that what they had to do was to catch the minds of people in the first 7 years of life. And the Jesuits saying, give me the child until the age of 7, and I'll give you the adult. They thought very carefully about education, and they were, unlike the Dominicans and others who used to flog such education as they imparted to their pupils, into their pupils. That was the sort of, I wasn't at a Dominican school, but whoever ran that school had that outlook on life, and I still don't sit down for very long, and it's many years later. But the Jesuits thought differently about education. They said, you must treat a child as a jar with a narrow neck, that if you pour things in slowly and carefully, you can fill the jar. But if you try and pour in too quickly, nothing will go in. And so they thought very carefully about the psychology of education, and they set out a program for their schools, and this was in the late 16th century. But they were conscious, obviously, of a tradition that went back very much further, all the way back, indeed, to the Sparta of Lycurgus, because you know that he is the great lawgiver of Sparta, had thought very carefully about the education of children. And it was he who said children should be taken or boys anyway, should be taken at the age of 7 and should be put together into camps and classes, and they should be educated up in a very vigorous, demanding kind of way so that they would be great soldiers at the end. There, the education was to produce a nation which was an army. And the city of Sparta was, in fact, an army camp. And everything that had to do with the warrior virtues was inculcated from that very early age. But it worked. It did produce a state of citizen soldiers. And Sparta, for many, many centuries, indeed for about 500 years, was the dominating city-state of the Greek world, and played a very important part, therefore, along with Athens, in the defeat of the Persian invasion, wonderfully told by Herodotus. So way back, 2,500 years or more, people were thinking very carefully about what to do and were putting those thoughts into practice because they all believed, and they had empirical grounds for believing it, that education works. Education changes people, education forms and shapes people, and that a society which thinks about education carefully and, tremendously importantly, invests in education sufficiently is going to have an impact on people. And so a lot of different questions arise. And one of the central, most burning questions is, what therefore should the principles be, the moral principles be, on which an education of the very young and the young and of young adults be? What are those principles? Is it right to make children believe certain things or think certain things or have a certain way of responding to the world, of having a certain mental attitude? Was it right for the Spartans to breed up their young boys and youths into the attitude, the mindset, the preparedness of soldiers? Quite deliberately, Lycurgus and the kings and senate of Sparta for many centuries after his time wouldn't allow Spartans to travel. Very, very few of them were allowed to go abroad on embassies. They didn't trade much because, of course, they didn't have money. Lycurgus got rid of gold and silver, and they had these extremely heavy iron coins, which were difficult to accumulate or carry. You needed to pay for something like a horse. You had to get an ox and cart to take your money to the vendor. And for this reason, there was no luxury items. There was a law which forbade using anything other than an axe and a sword to build your house. So it was impossible to have decorated ceilings and the rest of it. One of the kings of Sparta went to Corinth on an embassy on one occasion and was put into a sumptuous bedchamber, and he was absolutely amazed to think that the trees in Corinth grew in such extraordinary convoluted forms. So there we could ask, was that right to do that to generation after generation after generation of kids? Think about Thomas Gray's Elegy. Think about the muting glorious Miltons and the Hamdens who never got a chance. Think about all that possibility of talent and genius in the human mind and the human spirit, because we, after all, are clever primates, quashed by this extremely rigorous and very limiting education that directed these children, rather as an espalier tree is directed in one particular direction. So to stamp out poetry, to stamp out philosophy, to stamp out an interest in history, just to direct them and coach them into thinking that it was dishonorable to think of anything else other than being a warrior, somebody who could endure cold, who had no fear, who valued his comrades so much and their opinion of him so much that he would do anything for them and die for them, and certainly not want to step out of line and be unconventional. Unconventionality and innovation is, of course, the very lifeblood of humanity. In the same way, Sparta didn't allow foreigners. They didn't want to trade with anybody. They didn't want anybody bringing in different ideas or different ways of dressing or behaving. Didn't want anybody coming in who knew any poems and might tell them to the children. And so you could raise a challenge on that basis about what principles underlie an educational system if you don't want it to be one which is very deeply tendentious in the way that the Spartan one was, or in the way in which a Jesuit school is, or in the way in which any school founded in order to coach up, breed up, direct the children in its care into a certain way of thinking and responding, into a certain kind of attitude. Because for very good evolutionary reasons, children are credulous and imitative. And if you put them into an environment where those they take to be authoritative and knowledgeable, the adults in their environment, tell them certain things, for example, that there is a purple three-legged goat that lives on the first cloud next to the sun, and we've all got to worship it and pray to it and so on, they will believe it. That will be true for them. And if there's great social reinforcement behind it, that belief will remain a possibility for them. Even if it doesn't remain active for them, they may recur to it when there are opportunities to do so. Divorce, grief, the death of a loved one, failure in life in some way, any moment of vulnerability in life which will make them turn to and clutch those things that were important to them and which they believed when they were little. So you have to be very careful what it is that you implant in their minds. I like the example rather of one of the dissenting academies that was founded in the 1780s by no less a person than J.B. Priestley and his colleagues Price and some of the other leading figures in the dissenting world of the time. Because as you may know, the great old universities in the 18th century were interested only in their cellars, the port and wine they had in their cellars. The examination in Hebrew at Oxford was what is the meaning of the word Golgotha? And if you happened to know that it meant place of skulls, you passed. That was it. That was your divinity exam. So it wasn't intellectually very taxing. In fact, a lot of the people who went to Oxford and Cambridge in the 18th century found it much less informative than their schools had been. The one small difference is that they weren't caned as often, and they were also allowed to drink and keep horses and go hunting. But the educational institutions which at that time were really cutting edge were these dissenting academies, of which perhaps the most famous was the Warrington Academy. At these places, the youths, and I'm afraid they were not girls, were taught modern languages, mathematics, science, history, geography, philosophy, logic. None of these things, well, very few of them anyway, philosophy and logic perhaps, but none of the others, apart from the ancient languages, were taught at the old universities. These were very advanced institutions. And the one that Price and Priestley founded in Hackney, it's called the New College of Hackney, was one such institution. It was funded by wealthy industrialist dissenters in order to produce new generations of dissenting ministers for the Unitarians and others. But the great principle in that college was that the boys should think for themselves, that they should be critical, that they should ask questions, that they should accept nothing on authority, nothing on trust, but they should investigate and think for themselves. The result was that when William Hazlitt, the great William Hazlitt, was there as a pupil, all the pupils became agnostic. And alas, the college had to close down because its funders were very dismayed to find that the preceptors at the college and the boys at it had all taken this thing about thinking for themselves far too seriously. They'd actually done so. But if you thought about the principle that lay behind it, that these pupils were being challenged to think, to ask questions, to try and work things out, to go through to the very end of something. I don't know whether I mentioned to a meeting here recently, but I did a program with Richard Harries, an awfully nice man, used to be the Bishop of Oxford, called The Bishop and the Atheist. I was the bishop, of course, mainly. Okay. I don't know whether you heard it on Radio 4. We went to a Church of England school here in London, and we were met by the headmistress, a very nice lady who sat us down and said, firstly, let me explain to you the ethos of the school. It's a Church of England school. Most of the people here are Anglicans, but we also have some Muslims and Catholics, and they even found one atheist girl in the sixth form, and she figures in this story, as you'll see. And she said, our great thing here is that we want them all to be full of mutual respect and, collegial, to be together. We promote togetherness and mutual kindness and so on. In fact, we're going to introduce you to some girls, one of whom is Catholic, one Muslim, one Anglican, and one the atheist girl. And they're all great friends. They do their homework together, and they're all in the sixth form together. And I said to her, well, I suppose that you expect us to applaud you for what you've just said. But that's absolutely the very least that one would expect of you. If you weren't doing it, you would be culpable. What I would applaud you for is to hear that you had asked these children in the school, with their different backgrounds and religious commitments and so on, whether they really thought about what they were committed to believing or what they'd been told to believe. Had they really worked their way right through to the bottom of the bag on this or not? That's the thing that we would applaud you for. If at the school you took all these people from different religious backgrounds and produced agnostics at very least, then that would be something, because it means that you would have got them thinking about where they were. So they got together these girls, these four girls who were friends, and I asked the Muslim girl, I said, your friend here, you do your homework with her, she's a Catholic, now she has refused the teaching of the last prophet. What is going to happen to her when she dies? I would rather not say it. I said, come on. What would somebody of your faith say about somebody who refused to accept the teaching of the prophet? Well, she's going to hell. So I said to the Catholic girl, now your church says that there is no salvation outside the church. No one comes to the Father but through me, it says in the scriptures. So she is a Muslim girl. She hasn't accepted that. In fact, she has a false prophet. We were warned against them. What's going to happen to her when she dies? Well, she's going to hell. So I said to the two of them, and what's going to happen to the atheist? Oh, she's going to hell. They both said they at least agreed on that one. So there was it. Richard Harries and the headmistress of the school were appalled. They were both rather ashen at this moment. And they said to me, oh, you're sowing dissension and, division, and you're setting them against one another. And I said, no, I'm not. I'm just asking them to think of the consequences of what it is that they believe they believe. The consequences of things that they've been told all their lives and when they go to church and so on. This is a consequence. Let them look at one another in the face and say, my religion tells me that that person, sweet, kind friend, my best friend, she's going to go for eternal torment, or at least several million years in purgatory, depending on which way you look at it. That's what my religion says to me. Can I really accept that? Why? On what grounds? What possible logic? That's what I want them to think. They could come up with an answer. They might, try out some bit of casuistry on us, but at least to think it through. And if an education system is not getting people to think things right the way through and to face difficult questions and to have to come up with a case and really research it and work it, then that educational system is failing. And I think that you can make a very strong argument indeed for saying that the principle that underlies an educational endeavor, if it were one such which says, I want the output of this educational institution to be people who are knowledgeable, reflective, who think, who challenge, who don't accept what we tell them, who haven't turned them into social blue tack onto which anything that we like can be stuck for our convenience, that if we produce people who will be prepared to, will want to, will see it as a really important thing to do, to look at the evidence, to look at the case made for something and to think for themselves. If that's what we can do, then we've got a very, very, very successful educational system. And I'm quite sure, and I know for a fact that it's the case, that in a lot of schools, of course, teachers, for whom I have the most tremendous respect, I really do. I think the hard work done and the hours put in and the commitment made by teachers in our schools. I really makes me annoyed when I hear criticism of our schools, struggling with lack of resources and lack of support and the rest. They do a wonderful job, and in so many of those schools, that's what they're trying to do, especially with kids in the later years. And if we allow this situation now, where the funding cuts are going to bite, and wherever there are funding cuts, it always starts opening the door for all the funny folk in the shadows to start creeping in, taking over and grabbing part of the influence. And along with that, this business of the active and energetic promotion of more academy schools, many of which may very well be faith-based schools, that we will see that this principle, the principle of turning informed, reflective and critical people who think for themselves, that principle is going to be undermined. Because whatever people say about faith schools, and of course, if you go to a Church of England school, they'll say to you there, well, we're not in the business of converting and of persuading. And this may be true of a lot of Church of England schools, because after all, the Church of England is so latitudinarian and so Laodicean and so open-minded that its brains fell out a heck of a long time ago, and they're not really in the business of proselytizing people. But it's terribly hard to believe that in a Catholic school or in a Muslim school, or even perhaps in a Jewish school in an Orthodox area, that the culture, the traditions, the beliefs, the outlook are not going to be a big part of the story. And if they are a big part of the story, they're going to train the wood, the grain of the wood in those children in a way which means that at least some of them are ever afterwards, for the whole of their lives, going to be affected by that fact. That they have been coached into, trained into, thinking, feeling, responding in a certain way, rather than being in a position to make those choices for themselves. The ultimate value, the ultimate right that any human being has is to be autonomous about those very important choices, about the way that they respond to the world and what they choose to do in it. And if their education goes against that, then that is a deep, deep crime against childhood, in my view. And that's why this thing tremendously matters. Now, the British Humanist Association is working very hard on this. There's a discussion coming up in Parliament next week about academy schools. Very little in the bill that provides any kind of protections against this distorting effect. And I've been asked by the new director of the BHA to conclude, therefore, on an extremely important message, which is put some money in the envelopes which are going around here to support the work of the BHA, because it's tremendously, tremendously important work. Thank you very much.